today. We will get started in just a few moments. Just giving everybody a few minutes to sign in, and then we will get started. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for tuning in today. My name is Maggie Downing. I'm the manager of digital imaging at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia. And I'm here with Lee Price, Director of Development at the Conservation Center. Today we'll be discussing fundraising for digitization, and this is the first series in our Digitization 201 series, which builds on the 101 series I presented over the summer about digitization project planning. So for this series, I've decided to recruit other amazing expertise at the center to help address issues of fundraising, handling original objects, and setting up a digitization studio. The series is presented with support from grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the William Penn Foundation. This episode is being recorded and will be made available in the next day or two on our YouTube page. And a link will be also sent to all of the participants watching today. We will be monitoring the chat box for questions, and we will try to address all of the questions at the end of the presentation. So one of the main points in Digitization 101 is that there is a lot involved in digitization projects and planning. You have to prioritize your projects, think about metadata, digital storage and ongoing preservation, and putting images online for the public, and purchasing equipment and finding the staffing to do all of this. Budget restrictions can make a project seem impossible. But today we're here to talk about some funding opportunities that can help get your project off the ground without having to increase your institution's general operating budget. So some of the major funding strategies are listed here on this slide. And today's sessions will primarily focus on the first two, although you can ask questions at the end about the others. So today I've recruited our Director of Development, Lee Price, and we will be looking at some exciting upcoming grant opportunities and some strategies for making your grant request stronger. During his 19 years at the Conservation Center, Lee has assisted more than 100 cultural institutions with grant preparation for collection stewardship projects, as well as providing ongoing fundraising for the center itself. He served as lead writer on IMLS Connecting to Collections preservation plans for 3 states, and is now serving as a strategic planning consultant for New York State collecting institutions and as an advisor to a major 5-year project with the HBCU Library Alliance to build capacity at their 71 member libraries. So thank you so much, Lee, for joining us today. My first question is, what kinds of projects can you fund through grants?
Oh, hi, Maggie. I was really thrilled to be asked to join you in the first episode of Digitization 202. And I really jumped at the opportunity because to talk about fundraising right now, especially fundraising for digitization, it's just a very timely topic right now, especially because there's a very attractive opportunity looming. And so this just seemed to be the right moment to promote the topic. So I have to master navigation here.
There we go.
Okay, that worked unexpectedly. I don't know what I did though, so I may have problems with the next slide when I reach it. First, stepping back to look at the big picture, I'd say there are roughly, this is the question you asked here, Maggie, there are roughly 4 types of projects that you might want to fundraise to support. So first on the list here, the digital preservation assessments, they are documents that demonstrate you've invested some time and thought into your digitization planning and your strategies to preserve your digital records over time. So these documents are they're the digitization equivalents of the preservation needs assessments, or the equivalent of CAP grants, if you've received a CAP grant in the past. These would be the equivalent of them, but for digitization. They bring in an outside expert to report on recommendations. So just as with the preservation needs assessment, these digital preservation assessments, well, they're fantastic tools that serve as a foundation for subsequent fundraising. They're perfect for including as supporting documents, and you can directly quote from them in your narrative requests. Second on the list here is the capital request. One of the things that the digital preservation assessment examines is whether you should be digitizing internally with your own internally staffed digital imaging studio, or whether you should use an outside vendor. Now, if you decide to set up your own studio, that's where these become very important. You'll likely need some outside funding for the equipment, software, maybe even additional staffing. Third bullet here, the planning grants. Grants are generally for fairly large projects. And these grant-funded projects will bring in outside professionals to help you create a project scope and strategies for implementation, it helps you think through the workflow, to create a timetable, to identify vendors, and sometimes to bring in a conservator to do a conservation survey to check the fragility of items targeted for digitization. National Endowment for the Humanities particularly likes to see that component, the conservation survey, that you've looked at the fragility so you aren't flaking your documents off and losing pieces of them as they're digitized. It's always good to stabilize first. Maggie has worked on a number of these planning grants, and our conservators frequently work on the conservation surveys that are a component of some of these. And last, on the bottom here, the 4th bullet point is the implementation grants. That's when the fund starts. They provide the funding to actually plunge in and implement the plan.
Awesome. Can you talk about some of the specific funding sources for these different types of digitization grants?
Yeah, and this is why I was so excited to come here, because this is the heart of what I wanted to share today. These funding opportunities that I've selected, I've selected 3 funding opportunities to highlight, and then after that, I'll just offer some fast pointers for other places to look. So first up, we have the CLEAR grants, with CLEAR short for Council on Library and Information Resources. All collecting institutions are eligible for these, well, virtually all. Museums, libraries, archives, even some government units, with the caveat that if you are a government unit, please check in advance the fine print to make sure that you're eligible. But most nonprofit collecting institutions are eligible for these. No match required. They'll cover just about everything with the funding, with one exception, and we do consider it an important exception. The CLEAR grants don't fund any conservation treatment to stabilize the material before digitization, and that can be a concern when dealing with aging, fragile material. Also, just so you're aware going in, the CLEAR grants are very competitive. And it's a two-part application, with both parts being pretty time consuming. So you have to plan in advance that you're going to really commit to this. On the positive side, they can be very worth it. They will cover the project, and they are prestigious grants. They're ideal for digitizing collections of national scholarly interest, just so long as they're in fairly good condition. Next up, we have the HCFR grants, the Humanities Collections and Reference Resources grants that are offered by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And these come in two sizes: the Foundations grants, which are for planning, and the implementation grants for actually getting the work done. And we like, at the Conservation Center, we like and we highly recommend approaching these as a two-part project. So first, you get the Foundations grant, and frequently it's Maggie going on site and working with the planning team. And then you go back for the implementation grant to actually implement the project that you've already described, that you've already developed your plan for, that NEH has already invested in. There's some cost share with both of these grants, both the Foundations and the implementation grants, but it's a relatively minor cost share, and it's often largely covered by in-kind staff time, as opposed to having to raise large amounts of money. Scholarly importance is key here. You have to make a real good argument with NEH that you have a truly important collection, and that scholars are eager to access it more easily through digitization. And these grants can additionally cover treatment to stabilize any fragile material. So that's unlike CLEAR. CLEAR will not cover the conservation treatment, but HCR, the NEH will cover them. Competition is fairly competitive for these, and the application is, I'd say, medium hard by government standards. And our third grant, well, this is the one that I was excited about. This is the one that I really want to promote at this point, because the deadline is approaching. There's still around 6 weeks to pull it all together by the mid-November deadline. So if you want, I feel very strongly that there's definitely still time to pull a really good digitization project together for this grant category. And that is if you can do this one, because I'm sure we have some libraries and archives who are on today, and this is not a grant category that's open for libraries and archives unless they are libraries and archives attached to a museum. Inspire and Museums for America are on the museum side of IMLS, not the library side. They are just about, the listed here is two different grants: Inspire grants for small institutions and the Museums for America, but they're just about exactly the same grant, and both even share the same deadline. Inspire is, as it says, for small institutions, and that small is left ambiguously undefined by IMLS. With these, you can go for up to $50,000 for a digitization project under their collection stewardship category. It's a fairly easy application to write by government standards, and there's no match at all. So they will fund up to $50,000 of the project. And you just can't beat that. That is the best offer out there in the grant world right now. Now with Museums for America, that's a bit tougher. That's for museums of any size, but it really now is particularly aimed for medium size up to the supersized institutions, and they can go for a much larger digitization project, up to $250,000. That's $250,000 that does have to be matched one-to-one, because Museums for America does have that one-to-one matching requirement. So when it says if you apply for a Museums for America grant of 250,000, that would be for a $500,000 project, which would be quite a project, but also quite a challenge to have to raise an additional 250,000 for it. So these are three of my favorite grants right now. You know, there's IMLS has 2 grants there, but these are some of my favorite grants, and particularly if you're a museum, seriously look into IMLS Inspire, because that is this is a good time to go for grants that do not require matches. So if you could go for something like that, it's a pretty wonderful grant opportunity. Okay, just some fast other opportunities. NHPRC grants are the main grants that are offered through the National Archives and Records Administration. Save America's Treasures were great for a while, and then they went away, and now around 2 years ago they returned, and they seem to be back, possibly for good. And we're anticipating release of guidelines for the next round of Save America's Treasures any minute now. And I don't know this for sure, but I'm anticipating probably we'll be seeing a December deadline. So they may very well release it, and you'll just have, you know, 4 to 6 weeks to pull it all together. Definitely check out what's available at the state, county, and local levels. If you're a Native American or African American institution, check out what both IMLS and NEH have to offer, because they both have special categories that may be very attractive. And I'll also say that NEH and IMLS, if you're wondering if you fit a category, say if you're wondering with IMLS, if you fall under what their definition of a small institution is, you can just give them a call. They're very good about returning phone calls, or generally when I want to speak to somebody there, I send them an email first, give them some idea of what I want to talk about, and ask when is a good time to talk. And just my experience with NEH and IMLS is that they're very good about getting back to you. And there are other fundraising strategies that I've listed here, and that was on one of the first slides as we were going in. These other fundraising strategies that might be more attractive for you than grant writing. I'm only really covering grant writing today, but there are other ways of raising money too. And when you have limited resources, as just about everybody I work with does have limited resources, you figure out what your strengths are and you invest time in your strengths.
Lee, thank you so much for this very great and specific advice. As I mentioned, Lee is definitely our in-house expert on fundraising and the grants. So we appreciate you sharing some of your favorite grants with us today. And I hope that it is giving our participants some good ideas and inspiration. I want to read out one of these questions in the chat box and then move on to our next section. So we have a question: do you expect Inspire and MFA grants to be continued? And can you apply once for planning and once for implementation?
With Inspire and MFA has been around for quite a while, the Museums for America. I think that one's pretty solid. As long as NEH and IMLS are around, I think both these categories, you know, looking at the humanities collections and reference resources, as well as these IMLS grants, I think these categories are around to stay for a while. The IMLS staff was very excited to start offering Inspire back several years ago.
Great.
And I just see them as I mean, they're very gung-ho behind them. So
Awesome.
they want to help the small institutions as much as possible. Can you apply once for planning and once for implementation? With NEH and the HCRR grants, very much so. Those are really built for go for the planning and then go for the implementation. We're seeing organizations do very well with that. With Inspire, I would actually look at Inspire for maybe a combination planning and implementation grant, or just a plain implementation grant, but just on a much smaller scale than a grant for Museums for America. If you, there might be some grants where you do the planning through NEH with the those foundations grants through HCRR. And then you could go for a Museums for America grant after that. There are different types of mix and match that, you know, I'm always happy to talk to an institution about what approach will work best for them.
Great. Thank you, Lee. And so I wondered if you could spend a little time and talk about some tips for putting together a strong grant application.
Well, you mainly just share a compelling story. But here are a few ideas on making that application a little stronger. Some areas that you should be seriously looking at when you're putting your narrative together in order to make a good sales pitch out of it. First, demonstrate within the grant this project, the one that you're requesting funding for, is the natural next step in a long-term process. In other words, well, in this case, you've got the digital preservation assessment done already. You've done planning for this project, like say you've had a conservation survey of the material, and you've worked through the workflow, what that should look like, and you know how you're going to be sharing all these images to the general public. And you have that written down, you've got that in a document. At that point, you just show that you've done steps A, B, C, and now the natural next step is step D. You should fund the next step in the process. We've done the first 3 steps very well. They've been successful small projects for us, and now you should fund the big one because that's what all that was leading up to. Make a strong case for the importance of making the targeted items or collections accessible. Ideally, quote from humanities professionals, scholars, and authors about the value of this particular project. Ideally, even mention how they've used this material in the past. And this is, in some of these grants, you're going for letters of support from scholars who will attest to the importance of your collection. And those are the exact same people who you can even just draw a sentence out of the letter of support and go ahead and be redundant and put that sentence inside the proposal as well. Yeah, if you know somebody who appreciates your collection and they're a good name in the field, and a good name in the field, in the humanities field, is any professor at a college or university is considered a good source to borrow a quote from. So have a strong plan also for how you're going to disseminate the images through. Well, this is an area that I know less about because this changes fairly rapidly. But lately, the proposals I've been working on have been mainly disseminating the images through Digital Public Library of America. But Maggie, do you have anything more to add there?
Yeah, I can just say a few words about the Digital Public Library of America, or DPLA, and it acts as a content aggregator, and so what it does is it brings together metadata and images from libraries, archives, and museums around the country, so they can be all searched in one place by researchers. But you can also work with regional consortium networks if you have some peer institutions, or you can start one with regional museums or collections in your area. But the key to the dissemination is just having a plan to make your images available online and accessible to wide audiences. So that's going to be what makes your proposal very attractive to these funders. It's just making sure you have a plan for that.
Thanks, Maggie.
Mhm.
Show the last point here, the fourth bullet, show that you've thought through sustainability questions. How are you ready to ensure that this material will still be accessible 10 years after it goes online? The digitization world, all the standards, they change rapidly. And so you should have schedules for checking on quality assurance, including digital backups and digital migration. Maggie, can you help out here at all too? This is
Yeah, and this is something that we discussed, or I discussed, in the Digitization 101 series, specifically in episodes 2 and 3. If you want to check that out on the CCAHA YouTube page, I'll put a link in the chat to there as well. So digital records are very vulnerable because of all these changes constantly happening in operating systems and hardware and media and file formats. It's all always changing. So it's important to have an ongoing commitment to preservation of your digital records at the very start of your project and demonstrate that. Just so you don't want to digitize, thousands of images only to have them not read on a computer 10 years from now. So again, it's just very important to think about the ongoing, long-term digital preservation plan before you even get started thinking about the digitization project. So I am going to search for put a link for our YouTube page. And Lee, I'll just kick it back to you. On this note, how can an institution know when they're ready to apply for one of these grants?
well, remember that first slide? Going back to that first slide, the digital preservation assessment is really the best place to start. If you plan on using outside vendors, I look at this as a three-step process: a grant for assessment, a grant for planning, and then a grant for implementation. And on the other side, if you want to do it in-house, it's good to do the assessment first if you don't have that internal studio set up yet, and then be going into the raising money to establish the digitization studio that you've received recommendations from outside experts now that all these items should be included within your digitization studio. So you build your digital imaging studio through capital requests, and then it's the exact same thing. You can move to going for implementation grants to fund some of your big digitization projects. Now, if you're impatient or that you feel that you can truly make the case right now that you don't have to do all the planning, or that you can do the planning without too much external assistance, you can always skip a category. You can skip straight to planning. You can even skip all the way straight down to implementation if you want to. It's not ideal, but places do it and they do get funding. So, nothing's written in stone on this. There are other ways to do it. Just if in helping an institution move along this track, this is a thoughtful planning process to move into doing some really good work of digitizing your collections and making them accessible to not only the general public, but to the scholarly audiences that we want to be getting this material out to as well.
Great. So if somebody at an institution feels that they are ready to apply for a grant but feel somewhat overwhelmed by the process, who can they turn to?
Well, you and me, Maggie. They can turn to us.
Well, that's right.
In general, the consultant that you're working with on planning the project And here, that's where Maggie and I both put our hands up. We can do that, but other places can too. If you're looking for a vendor that can do this type of work, they should be willing, especially this is in the planning grants. If they're working in the planning grant, or if you're just going straight for an implementation grant and you sort of pick someplace that you'd like to be the outside vendor who's going to be doing your digitization. At that point, you should have an expectation that your vendor is going to help you get the grant. And they should be willing to provide some language for the grant, describing who they are, providing the resumes, providing the letter of commitment, providing all that material, and also to review your narrative language as you put the grant together. There's no reason why they shouldn't be able to provide that kind of support. And they also should be there to help develop your budget and the budget narrative where you explain why things cost what they do. So at the Conservation Center, I mean, if it's a digitization project, frequently Maggie and I are both working on it to make sure that both the technical details of digitization are right, and that's what Maggie's making sure of, and that you've worked through the plan effectively for dissemination at the end. And I'm frequently on the team making sure that you get all the supporting documents you need in a timely way from us, and that it's a strong and compelling grant narrative, trying to see if we can punch it up at all. So we're there for you if you want to work with us, and if you want to work with another vendor. I think you have a reasonable expectation that they should be ready to provide those type of services too.
Super. So just to wrap up, and then we'll have some time for some questions, but I wanted to plug our upcoming episodes in the Digitization 201. On November 10th, we have Caring for Originals During Digitization, and I'll be speaking with Heather Hendry, our senior paper conservator. And then on December 8th, I'll be talking with our photographer here about setting up a digitization studio with a camera and copy stand set up. So if you want to go to the next slide there, Lee, we have both of our email addresses here. Feel free to email us about any questions you have, but we also do have some time to take some questions in the chat. So if you want to put them in there, we can read them and answer them. Thanks everyone for attending. And we have one link there in the chat to sign up for the next episodes in this series.
I'm hoping that some of you go for the IMLS Inspire grants, because they've really rapidly become one of my favorite grant opportunities. And if you're thinking about digitization, it's a good place to go, a very good place. Another thing that I didn't mention, this is everybody signing off, NEH has another category called Preservation Assistance Grants for smaller institutions. And just so you know, don't go to them for digitization planning. They like the digitization planning requests to go through the category of the HCRR, the Humanities Collections and Reference Resources. So, preservation assistance grants are very attractive grants, and they can cover a lot of things, but they're not at the moment being used for digitization planning.
Lee, would these organizations also be good for getting funding for fellowships that are related to the project?
I'm not sure. IMLS and NEH have some opportunities for fellowships, but these particular grant opportunities, probably not. I'm not sure about Museums for America. There may be a bullet point in there allowing for fellows, but most of their fellowship programs are actually sort of standalone fellowship programs.
And how long does it take to hear back about grants?
About the same time it takes to have a baby, around 9 months, generally. That's the federal grants. You know, you can go for other private foundation grants can turn around much sooner. The clear grants are about, I think, 9 to 10 months right now from beginning to end, but I said it's a two-part process. So, you know, it's 3 months, you put in your application, wait 3 months and find out if that's passed muster or not. And then you have to put in a second application after that and wait another 5 months.
There is one question here. A recording will be shared. We'll send a link to all of the participants in the next day or two, and then it'll also be available on our YouTube page. So here is another question. Do you know any sources of grants to digitize newspapers that were published after 1965, some more recent newspapers?
Yeah, there was a big newspaper digitization project that has pretty much run its course right now. I'm not sure. Offhand, I don't know of any. Do you know of any, Maggie? Have you heard of any for newspapers?
No, not specifically to newspapers. No, not off the top of my head.
If it's you know, if it's newspapers or newsletters that have real humanities value, compelling humanities value, and they're not available through any other source, the IMLS categories are perfectly fine for making that argument for them. And that goes for NEH as well. I mean, if this is material that has humanities value and it's not available to the scholarly community, then digitizing it. Now, there is a problem with digitizing newspapers that were published after 1965, and the dissemination becomes a real concern because of copyright issues. And that's something that has to be looked into in the planning process to make sure that you can make these freely available. All of the grants we're talking about today with CLEAR, NEH, and IMLS, all of them want you to do your digitization projects, but then to make the images available on platforms like, you know, through Creative Commons licenses. So, so it becomes very important to make sure that you figured out not only how you're going to digitize those newspapers, but how are you going to make them, how are you going to make them available to your audience, legally available, because you do have to look through the copyright issues.
There's one suggestion in the chat to possibly try at Library of Congress, see if they have any funding available. And there's another suggestion in the chat box for the Pennsylvania State Archives. They have a records care grant that can be used for digitization. It says this year's application cycle just ended, but it opens each year in May with grants up to $15,000. Do you want to add anything to that, Lee?
They started that just a couple of years ago, and it is a fantastic grant program for Pennsylvania institutions. If you have an archive, a library, and you have some historic records, it may not be a digitization grant, but it is a great source for projects like this. And it's grants up to $15,000. Grants up to $5,000 don't require a one-to-one match. You can put in for a full $5,000 project to get it covered. You might be able to get together a nice little planning project for that amount. And then, yeah, for anywhere from 5,000 to 15,000, it does require a one-to-one match. So those are for slightly larger projects.
Great. And there is a link in the chat for all the attendees to a link to that grant. There's another question in the chat box. Should you apply to more than one grant at the same time for the same project?
If by chance you apply for the same project to two institutions and you get them both, you're going to have to go back to one of them and explain what happened and see if you can come up with ideas for expanding the project, or just reaching more people through the project, maybe somehow increasing project scope so that the money that they're ready to allocate will be used for a very good project that just sort of expands on the idea of the first. It's actually not a bad place for you to be into, for you to do. There are some applications that ask if you've applied elsewhere for money for the same project. And if you're doing that, you just have to honestly answer yes. But the downsides for applying to more than one place, I mean, considering that, most grants have a 5 to 35% chance of getting funded, and time marches forward quickly and you're waiting 9 months to hear about them. If you have the time to invest in the grant writing, there's not much downside to applying to more than one funding source for the same grant project. I just don't see much downside.
Great. Thank you, Lee. I've seen the questions kind of slowing down in the chat box, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. But if you do have any additional questions, our emails are right there. Feel free to reach out, and I look forward to presenting again in 1 month. Thanks, everyone.